Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Omnia Performance Podcast. I'm your head coach, JB, and today I'm flying solo. And I'm here to talk about something we get asked about a lot, both online and by athletes we all coach day to day. And it is, how do you train for a marathon while still building muscle? So we're not talking about just not losing muscle. I think there are plenty of programs out there online that do that kind of include strength training as a bit of a secondary thought and addition. It's not just about doing like a little bit of strength work on the side. Like, you often see it in these running programs that are pre-built templates where you'll be doing some circuit training and stuff, and that has its place, but it's not quite what we're looking for, right? So instead, we're talking about genuinely training for a marathon while still making progress in the gym. Okay. And straight away, we want to kind of go out strong and set the tone for this episode. It absolutely is possible. Okay. But it's not possible in all contexts, all volumes, for all athletes, all the time. Okay. We want to talk a little bit about the context, the nuance. We want to talk about where that overlap sits, how to train inside that overlap, and how to avoid making this harder than it needs to be. So first of all, we've got to bring up the interference effect. Okay, so most people have heard of this, and it's where endurance training sends signals to improve efficiency and to increase your fatigue resistance. Strength and hypertrophy training sends signals to increase muscular force and muscle tissue size, and those signals are not the same. And as the interference effect suggests, they can interfere with each other. And the biggest issue that people make is that they treat their training and interference like it's an on-off switch, like it's binary. Okay, so if you run a lot, you look at your typical elite marathon runner, and they aren't particularly well muscled, and you often have this connotation for like bodybuilders and strongmen, like stronger guys and girls. And we often infer from that they have no endurance capacity, but that's not necessarily how biology and physiology works. Interference exists on a sliding scale, okay? And it's driven by a bunch of different factors. Could be the volume that you're training, could be how you're distributing your intensity across the week, or across your training week, how well you recover for whatever reason, could be sleep, could be nutrition. And it also is going to be dependent on your level of training advancement as well. So how well developed you are, how used to training in a certain style you are. And if you are running kind of like a reasonable amount, if you're lifting intelligently and fueling well, it's like muscle gain is absolutely possible. And in fact, I would go as far to say it's quite common. But when things break down, this is often when people set the running volume a little bit too high. They don't manage their fatigue very well, so they're not sleeping or perhaps eating enough, or their stress outside of the gym or outside of their running isn't very well managed or adjusted. And we'll come on to this in a moment as well. Their expectations might be slightly misaligned as well, okay, depending on if they're just doing like a lifting program, a running program, or both in the same program. And if we get to this point when things do start to break down, it's not that lifting just stops working. It's just that the signal isn't strong enough relative to the fatigue cost. Okay, so we need to address the balance somewhere to make sure that things are working again. Now, we have to appreciate, as I mentioned right at the beginning, there are a lot of contextual factors and a level of nuance that really matters. And if we're looking at how well you can build muscle as a runner, or as a marathon runner specifically, one of the most important variables is how trained that you already are. So if you're a newer or an intermediate lifter, you don't need that much stimulus to grow muscle. You can make some progress with fewer hard sets, and things don't need to be kind of more towards like the perfect end of things. Now, I would say with quite a high degree of confidence and certainty that athlete could often train for a marathon. They could lift a couple of times to 4 times a week, and it would still come out the other side of that process more muscular. However, an advanced lifter, and a very advanced lifter, is playing a very different game to our newbie. And if that person, and that might be you listening to or watching this, if that person is already very strong and well muscled, we need a much higher stimulus to grow. There's a smaller margin of error, and recovery often becomes the bottleneck. So if you need to do a ton of training to get more jacked, to get stronger, add marathon training on top, and it becomes very difficult. I wouldn't go as far to say that gaining muscle in those conditions would become impossible, but it definitely becomes harder to express consistently, especially as that running volume would climb up, as you would expect over the course of a marathon training program. So that's why I wanted to get this out of the way early. It's why blanket statements don't work. You can have two people and they could both be training for a marathon, but each person could be in very different physiological situations when it comes to trying to gain muscle whilst training for that marathon. So for some context, I trained for the London Marathon back in 2023, and I wasn't just kind of like doing training just to get around it. I was really trying to push myself as much as I could. I was running 80 to 100k a week, which is like not like crazy high volume in the context of marathon training, but it's decent. It was certainly felt like a lot at the time, and the running sessions really mattered. The long runs were pretty long for sure, and at the time I was still lifting quite seriously, and I was maintaining around like a 580 kilo powerlifting total, about 77 kilo body weight. And to be quite honest with you, I could still like stimulate muscle. I still could train in the gym for hypertrophy, for strength. I could train hard, but again, the honesty, I just didn't have the same energy to do it with full intent and aggression as I would do in a more focused weight training block. So I had to admit that my progress was slower. I had to very carefully manipulate sessions, and my recovery became a hugely important variable. Okay, so if I wasn't eating or sleeping enough, or there were other major stresses going on, it made things difficult. It meant that, muscle gain was a lot harder to come by. And again, it doesn't go to say that muscle gain was like completely impossible. It just meant I had a much smaller margin of error. Okay. Now, we now need to talk about volume. Okay, so if there is one thing that determines whether building muscle during marathon training is realistic, it's the amount of volume that you're doing. So it's not the act of running itself, it's the amount that you're doing. The devil is in the dose, as it were. So picture this, there is a very, very big difference between running 4 to 6 hours per week versus, say, running double that, 8 to 10 hours a week, let's say, or 10 hours or more. So at these kind of like lower to moderate volumes, muscle gain is very achievable due to the factors that we spoke about earlier. And that's even during a build up to a marathon. And again, especially for our hypothetical non-advanced lifters. Now, I should also throw a caveat in here. Again, I love a caveat, but we do need it for context. I would go out and say that most people are not as advanced as they think. Okay, so it's very difficult to quantify what beginner, moderate, and advanced are, but typically you're not quite as advanced as you think you are. You're not super close to your genetic ceiling, so try not to overestimate your level of advancement, as it were, because you're probably going to be doing yourself a disservice. Okay, you can probably handle more than you think. So again, at these moderate training volumes, if you're not advanced, you can still get some very, very good progress with your strength and your muscle mass. However, if you're running very high volumes, maybe maintenance or very small amounts of muscle mass and strength gain is a more realistic goal. And even then, if you're doing those big running volumes, those 8-10 hours plus, and you've got a job and you've got a family and you've got other stresses, that will require alone some pretty kind of good, careful, smart programming and planning. Okay. And this is why the question, can you build muscle whilst training for a marathon, needs lots of follow-up questions. There's lots of context. We need to have a real good think about what that actually looks like for the individual. So you have to think, how much do I actually need to run, or how much are you currently running? Okay. Now, Next, we can look at how we need to break down the actual lifting program. How are we going to structure it? Okay, so if muscle gain is a possibility during marathon training, and it absolutely is, we need to make sure that the lifting side of things is more on the efficient side rather than going for kind of more maximal recoverable volume. Okay, so typically there are many ways to skin a cat, but usually this would mean we need to have fewer exercises per session. Okay, so greater quality for the exercises that we are doing. We need fewer total working sets, so we're trying to get more bang for our buck and more done with less. We need some high intent on each set, so we need to make sure that those reps that we're doing are reasonably fatiguing. We're performing to not necessarily maximal, but a high RPE, but also making sure that we leave some reps in reserve, perhaps more often than usual, especially for lower body training. Okay, now you don't necessarily need to chase failure to grow muscle, but we do need a stimulus that you can recover from consistently. Okay, so this is where training experience comes in. You will learn as you become more experienced, the trainee, how close you are to failure, and you can kind of ride that line a little bit better than someone who doesn't have that experience. Okay, you can push right up towards failure without actually going to failure, and you may find that then you can subsequently recover a little bit better, and you're not putting yourself in an absolute hole. Now, for most athletes, what this kind of looks like: 2 to 3 lifting sessions, 2 to 4 hard sets per movement, 6 to 10 sets per body part across the week, and some clear progression rules as well. So are you trying? Do you have the intent to progressively overload from one session to the next? Note that I said the intent, not that you absolutely have to. Remember, we don't have to kind of set ourselves this arbitrary rule that you absolutely need to progress every session in order for the program to work. If you're not making that linear progression from week to the next, that does not mean that the program is not working. Far from it. Sometimes that progression is happening behind the scenes. It's just that how fatigued you are right now is meaning you can't express that strength gain just yet. Okay, that kind of strength gain and that linear progression that we're all often looking for. Now, doing all of that is enough to grow muscle, provided that the amount of running volume that you're doing will allow it. Okay, and as the running volume increases, the gym volume can come down, and we also want to make sure that if that is the case, we're still keeping the intensity nice and high. We want to keep that intent to be pushing hard, and making sure that that's still present. Try not to half-arse it. As the volume comes down, try not to drop the loads also. Try and keep the intent and the effort nice and high. Okay, now we have spoken about the training side of things at a decent length, talked about some nuance, some context. Now we've got to talk about what we're fueling with, what we're eating. Okay, now, if you are under fueling sometimes, or actually all the time, it's bad news. Okay, so all of that running can be somewhat catabolic, breaks down tissue. We want to be in a net anabolic state. Okay, so these long runs create muscle damage, and part of the reason why that creates muscle damage, or as a byproduct, we end up with carbohydrate depletion, and that may amount to the muscles becoming more easily damaged. So say you're doing a long run on the weekend and you aren't fueling properly, you end up in a very carbohydrate depleted state because you're not fueling sufficiently. When we come around to doing our lower body lift earlier on in that week, because of the muscle damage, we may not be in a good a place as possible to actually stimulate the muscle growth process. Okay, so instead, if we can fuel quite aggressively in our long runs, say 90 minutes and over, we can make sure that we reduce muscle breakdown. It will improve our recovery, generally speaking, and it will preserve, if not improve, our gym performance later on in the week. Okay, and it's not just about race performance. It's not just about practicing, taking in your gels for race day. It's about making your concurrent training sustainable. Okay, so if you want to run, you want to lift, you want to build muscle, you've got to feel like it actually matters. You have to give that just as much attention as you do what you're actually doing in the gym or when you're out running on the road or on the track. Okay, so I would like to propose to you all to present a framework, okay, how you can put this all together and how we can summarize everything. So you can absolutely build muscle during marathon training if your running volume is moderate, you're not already at an advanced level of hypertrophy. Okay, so if you're not an absolute muscle mass monster. Also, if your lifting is very well structured and your recovery and your calorie and protein intake are sufficient. And we just have to remember that as your running training volume increases, the likelihood is that your muscle gain slows. Note how I didn't say completely stops, it will just slow down. You may have to recognize that maintenance or very small amounts of muscle gain are actually now the win, okay? And therefore your expectations about what you're actually going to achieve out of all of this may need to adjust somewhat, okay? Now, this isn't like a failure on your part, it's just physiology at play, okay? Now, the athletes who do all of these things very well long term are the ones who periodize their priorities across the training calendar. So they'll have phases where they really hone in on muscle gain, okay? They're not trying to do everything to 100% all the time. They're having phases where I'm going to be building more muscle, so I'm going to reduce my running volume to a more maintainable level. And then when I've got a competition coming up or a race and I really, really want to focus, I'm going to spend 12 to 16 weeks dialing in on the running whilst putting weight training more towards a maintenance level and volume. Okay, so those smart athletes, they prioritize and periodize properly, and they adjust their volumes intelligently depending on where they are in their training calendar, and they don't try and max out every single adaptation all at once. You don't take 100% of a weight training program and 100% of a running program, smudge the two together and hope that it works, because chances are it just won't. Okay, now if this episode resonated with you and perhaps you're not quite sure how to apply it to your own situation, we've made that part a little bit easier. Okay, so myself, Jamie and Kelly, we've just built a brand new quiz that walks you through a series of questions about your training history, your goals, your time availability, your preferences. And at the end, it tells you exactly which Omnia template or product is best suited to you right now. So if you don't know where to start, this is such a really cool, valuable tool. And we don't just leave it there. We also give you a sample of the training program that could work best for you, so you can see how it's actually structured in practice. And the link to that quiz is now in our show notes. So, guys, that's all for today. Thanks for watching or listening, depending on your preferred medium, and we'll see you all next time.